Pulling Strings by Nigel Robinson. Mel shuddered as the double doors of the TARDIS sighed open and a bitter east wind swept through the control chamber. She glanced over reproachfully at the Doctor, who was already shuffling himself into his oversized duffel coat. There were times, Mel decided, when she definitely preferred his earlier persona. At least that Doctor, the one with the atrocious dress sense and the wayward waistline, had a taste for the comfortable good things of life. All this dour-faced one seemed to do was take her from one urban blight to another storm-swept death world. Hardly the wonders and delights he'd promised when he'd first snatched her from a comfortable but excruciatingly boring existence in Pease Pottage. He grinned at her with that infuriatingly superior expression of his, and offered her the fur coat which was hanging from the hat stand in the corner of the chamber, and whose lurid psychedelic colours hurt her eyes. The Doctor looked crestfallen as Mel grimaced. "Early 70s, he remarked as he helped her into it. "Belonged to a friend of mine. The 70s will be making a comeback one day, you know. ABBA, flares, platform souls." Mel shrugged in horror and disbelief and wrapped the coat tightly around her as the Doctor led the way out of the TARDIS. "So where are we?" she asked as she sheltered under the Doctor's umbrella from the torrential rain, which had already turned the ground into a vicious quagmire. The TARDIS had materialised on a wild open moor in the middle of a storm. Thunder rumbled ominously in the night sky, and sheets of lightning tinged the darkening clouds a cold metallic blue. The Doctor smiled and breathed in the fresh ozone-laden air. "Earth," he said. "I know that," said Mel. "There's nowhere else in the universe where the weather can be this bad. But where on Earth?" "Harrow Green," the Doctor volunteered. "The most haunted village in all England." Mel frowned. Harrow Green. The name rang a distant bell. Suddenly she remembered. "We're near Pease Pottage," she exclaimed, shouting above the noise of the thunder. "You've brought me home." "Well, not quite," said the Doctor, and brought out an elaborate pocket watch from his waistcoat. "It's the early 21st century, and Pease Pottage hasn't been your home for at least 30 years. "What do you mean? I moved up to London?" The Doctor tapped his nose. "You went travelling." "So what are we doing here?" Mel asked. "I'm a doctor," her companion said mysteriously. "I'm here to perform a bypass operation." Mel shook her head and laughed. If the Doctor was going to be enigmatic, she certainly wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing that she hadn't the faintest idea what he was talking about. "You know, Doctor, sometimes I just don't understand you at all." "Sometimes neither do I," admitted the Doctor. "But to everything there is a reason," he misquoted. "Bob Dylan?" "No, John Smith and the Common Men," the Doctor said, and pointed in the direction of a small group of buildings just visible on the horizon. "That's where we're needed." Through the rain, Mel could make out the electrified fence which surrounded the compound and the watchtowers manned by armed guards. Surely the Doctor didn't believe they could breach that sort of security. The Doctor indicated that she should look in the pockets of her psychedelic fur coat. She pulled out 2 official-looking passes, one of which bore a photograph of the Doctor she was with now, and the other of a terminally hip young woman from the early 70s. "So who's Josephine Grant?" she asked, and looked at the insignia on the cover of each of the passes. "And what's UNIT?" The Doctor grinned and led the way through the mud to the military establishment. The weasel-faced middle-aged scientist looked up angrily as the uniformed guards escorted the Doctor and Mel into the laboratory. "What the hell are these 2 doing here?" he barked as he took in the sight of the bedraggled Doctor and Mel. "We're at a crucial point in our work. It's essential that I am not disturbed." Mel shivered. There was something oddly disconcerting about the scientist, as if she had met him somewhere before, a long, long time ago. Things like that irritated her intensely. She was supposed to have a photographic memory after all. So why couldn't she remember where she'd seen Professor Clubman as his name tag identified him, before. The doctor shrugged off the attention of the 2 unit guards and strode up to Clubman, hand outstretched in greeting. "Professor Lionel Clubman, I presume," he said, and introduced himself as Dr. John Smith. Before the nonplussed scientist could reply, the doctor turned to the man's 2 white-coated colleagues. "And these are—" "My name is Professor Christine Rupy," said an attractive Frenchwoman in her 30s, and indicated the long-haired, untidily dressed man by her side. "And this is Dr. Bernd Lehmann." "An international team, I see," remarked the doctor. "And your specialities are?" "I'm an archaeologist and a physicist," Rupy replied. "Bernd here is a biologist and an anthropologist." "Look, just what are you doing here?" demanded Clubman. "This is a top-secret research establishment." "And I'm a top-secret advisor," said the doctor peevishly. "That's right, sir," said one of the guards. "He did have a unit pass." The doctor saw that the scientists were still none too impressed by this, so to divert their attention away from further questioning, he took an animated interest in the banks of machinery lining the wall and the plate-glass window which looked into an empty chamber. He clapped his hands with glee and strode over to the instruments. "I say, is this really what I think it is?" he asked eagerly, like a little child opening his presents on Christmas morning. Clubman glowered at him. "You seem remarkably well informed, Dr. Smith. You tell me." "It's a tachyon accelerator, isn't it?" the doctor said. From the astonished looks on the faces of Clubman, Christine and Lehmann, it was plain that he had guessed correctly. "What's a tachyon accelerator?" asked Mel. "A rudimentary time machine," the doctor explained, and turned back to Clubman. "You're experimenting with time technology, aren't you?" Clubman remained silent, but Christine and Lehmann exchanged a look of amazement at the doctor's knowledge. "And where else to experiment than at Harrow Green, the most haunted place in all England?" the doctor continued. "There have always been stories of ghosts and time slips in this area. Harrow Green stands on the temporal space nexus, where the strands of time are the weakest and easiest to break through." "How could you know that?" asked Christine. "We are only now making studies in that area." "Top secret," teased the doctor, and then added, "It'll never work, you know." "All our researchers say it will," insisted Lemon. "We've already sent animals back in time." "Animals?" asked the doctor. "Surely you weren't thinking of sending a human being back in time with this contraption, were you?" Clubman refused to answer, but Christine stepped forward. "As a matter of fact, yes," she said. "Bernd here has volunteered. He will be the first person to travel backwards in time." The doctor affected an expression of great concern. "But he can't. You mustn't," he said rather too melodramatically, thought Mel. "And who are you to say we shouldn't?" barked Clubman. "I'm the doctor," insisted the doctor, as if that explained everything. "If you've done your researches properly, you would have discovered that human tissue can't withstand tachyon bombardment." "Our tests have shown us that animals can," began Dr. Learman. "Animals, guinea pigs, hamsters," spluttered the doctor with contempt. "Have you brought any of them back?" "Well, no," Christine admitted. "And if you did, you'd find their bodies destroyed, their brains burnt out." The doctor looked knowingly at Clubman. "Time travel is not meant for mammals. Well, except certain time sensitives. And especially not for human beings," he insisted. "Better to live in the present than to relive the past." "Perhaps you would care to explain your theory?" asked Christine, who of the 3 scientists seemed the most reasonable. "I'd be delighted to," the doctor said, and seated himself down at a desk, casually throwing a whole pile of papers from the desk onto the floor at the same time. After 20 minutes of what to Mel sounded like some top-rate gobbledygook, Christine looked over at Clubman. There was a worried look on her face. "Lionel, if we could perhaps have a meeting?" Clubman harumphed angrily, but nevertheless followed Christine and Learman out of the room. "So what was all that about?" asked Mel when the 3 scientists had gone. "Top-rate gobbledygook," the doctor confirmed brightly, with not a word of truth in it. "So they're right, then. This tachyon accelerator will be able to send people back in time, she asked. Once only, agreed the Doctor. The strain of breaking through the timeline should produce a nice little explosion. Shouldn't you have told them that, then? No need. They'll have plenty of warning and time to get out, he said knowingly. But with the machine destroyed, whatever, or whoever uses it, will never be able to get back to the present day. Mel looked accusingly at the Doctor. He was definitely up to something. Are you meddling again, Doctor? I never meddle, Mel, he replied, without the slightest conviction. The three scientists were arguing with Christine, looking sadly at Clubman. I'm sorry, Lionel, she said, and meant it. Until we re-examine the Doctor's theories, there must be a halt to the time travel experiments. But we are at breakthrough point, he barked. We can't halt the experiment now just because some little man wanders in here and says we can't. He's not just some little man, he's UNIT's scientific advisor, and from all accounts a trusted friend of Brigadiers Lethbridge, Stewart and Bambera, Christine pointed out. Lionel, you're outvoted, I'm afraid, and we simply cannot put Burnt's life at risk until we know more about the forces we are playing around with. You're all cowards, Clubman hissed. If there had been people like you around in the past, we'd have never progressed beyond the wheel. With a snarl, he stormed out of the room. He's an angry man, replied Burnt. He initiated the project. The tachyon accelerator has been his life's work. We have a duty to be responsible, Burnt, Christine said. Now let's get back to the Doctor and his friend. But when they returned to the laboratory, the Doctor and Mel had gone. So what was all that about? Asked Mel as they trudged back through the mud and rain to the TARDIS. Aha! Said the Doctor cryptically, and opened the police box door for her. And it's not over yet. So where are we off to now? She asked, skipping through the open double doors and into the console room. The Doctor took out his pocket watch and consulted it. 1693, he said, and operated the dematerialization switch on the TARDIS console. Back at the Institute, Clubman looked at his watch. It was 4 a.m., and the Research Institute was deathly still. Silently, he slipped into the laboratory and viewed the tachyon accelerator. His crowning achievement, the project he had been working on ever since his days as a young student at university. His every hour had been spent on developing it, to the detriment of all else, friendships, security, relationships, and to be thwarted by cowards acting on the advice of a little man like the Doctor. The look that the Doctor had given him, almost forbidding him to use the accelerator, forbidding him, Clubman, to operate his own machine. Well, Christine and Learman might listen to the little man's prattlings, but not him. Determinedly, Clubman crossed over to the controls of the tachyon accelerator. The chamber behind the plate glass window was bathed in an eerie blue light, as tachyon energy shot out and coalesced from the energy panels which lined each of the four walls. Clubman took a deep breath and entered the chamber. The time energies bathed his body, briefly turning his skin transparent so that his bones and internal organs were visible if there had been anyone to watch. With a scream of anguish, Professor Lionel Clubman vanished from the 21st century forever. 2 hours later, the compound exploded in a burst of energy as the tachyon accelerator overloaded. There were no casualties, because some 90 minutes previously, the head of the security section had received a coded telephone message from an international terrorist group, warning him of a bomb on the premises, and the Institute had been speedily evacuated. The remains of the bomb were never found, and it was assumed that Professor Lionel Clubman had perished in the blast. The only mystery was the identity of the caller, whose voice the security head had described as having a soft Scottish lilt. "So where are we?" asked Mel as she stepped out of the TARDIS into a sunny wooded glade. 1693, I told you, said the Doctor. Not when, Mel said impatiently. Where? Harrow Green, said the Doctor, and looked around the glade. The site of what will one day be the Research Institute. From nearby there came a sound of groaning. The Doctor and Mel rushed over to the body lying against the trunk of a tree. "It's Clubman!" gasped Mel as she recognised the scientist. His face was blazed and scorched. "He used the accelerator and travelled back through time." "Who are you?" Clubman croaked through parched lips. "He doesn't recognise us," said Mel. "He's delirious," said the Doctor. "His body has been exposed to a massive amount of radiation in the space-time vortex. Is he going to die?" The Doctor shook his head and took a tub of pills out of his jacket pocket. He forced Clubman to swallow 2 of the tablets and placed the tub in Clubman's outstretched hand. "The tachyon accelerator was a fine piece of equipment," he said to the barely conscious scientist. "But it couldn't protect you from the time winds." "Will he be all right?" asked Mel. The Doctor looked sadly at Clubman. "He'll be scarred for life, I'm afraid." "But it will be a long and fruitful life." He stood up. "Come on, we must be off." "You can't just leave him here," protested Mel. "Can't we take him with us? He belongs in the 21st century." The Doctor grabbed Mel's arm and led her sternly to the TARDIS. "He must stay in the 17th century," he insisted, and shoved Mel through the open doors of the police box. As the TARDIS disappeared from 1693, Mel stared angrily at the Doctor, her hands perched on her hips. "I suppose you've got an explanation for what you just did back there," she demanded. "I didn't want Dr. Learman to use the tachyon accelerator," confessed the Doctor. "That's why I invented that whole load of gobbledygook for Professor Rupee. It would have caused too many temporal anomalies." "So? Clubman used it to travel back in time?" Mel was confused. "The timelines are still crossed." The Doctor shook his head. "Quite the opposite. Clubman travelling back in time was precisely what I wanted to happen," he said. "The accelerator was the culmination of his life's work. I knew he would use it. Humans are so predictable." He looked at Mel with a disappointed look on his face. "You still don't quite understand, do you, Mel?" Mel shook her head. The Doctor grinned. "Clubman will survive and settle down curiously well in the 17th century, he explained. As time goes by, he'll be respected for his great knowledge. He'll even end up becoming a member of the Royal Society." Mel thought she could see where the Doctor was leading her. "Don't tell me," she said. "There he's responsible for some great scientific breakthrough without which the 20th century would never have come about." "Nothing as mundane as that," said the Doctor. "In 2 years' time he will marry a delightful young lady named Martha. They will have children and then grandchildren. One of his granddaughters will marry a man named Bush and move to a tiny hamlet called Pease Pottage." "Wait a minute. Are you saying what I think you're saying?" The Doctor nodded. "Lionel Clubman is your ancestor, your 12 times great-grandfather. Without him you would never have been born, and that's why you arranged for him to be sent back in time with no way of returning," concluded Mel. "Then that means that... The Doctor smiled as he adjusted the controls and piloted the TARDIS on to new adventures. "That's right, Mel. Even before you were born, I've just gone and saved your life."